And so it was in Candlestick Park in San Francisco in 1966, August of 1966, that they gave their last concert. The shouting from the crowd was getting so loud anyway that it was beginning to drown out the music, and they could no longer hear themselves even play. And so it just wasn't any fun anymore. They had become targets basically by this point, and they realized that it just wasn't working. So that was their last concert, and so basically the show was over at this point. Although not quite. Paul McCartney came up with a brilliant and interesting idea that managed to salvage the band for a little while longer. Fortunately, there were some great albums left to create. And so what McCartney did was come up with the idea of creating virtual avatars. And so we begin to move now into the third Beatleverse, the third transformation of their electric avatars. With McCartney's idea of the creation now of virtual doubles of themselves, a band called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band that existed in a sort of parallel universe to them. And they would send that band on tour in their stead via a Yellow Submarine and also via a Magical Mystery bus tour. So they do this brilliant thing of sending themselves on tour virtually, in a virtual way. Yellow Submarine, by the way, is a song that carries over from Revolver, but it really is the wormhole, as it were, connecting that album with Sgt. Pepper's, just as the song Yesterday on the album Help was stylistically announcing the next album with Rubber Soul, and really should have belonged on Rubber Soul. And so that song Yesterday was the wormhole connecting them to the second Beatleverse, just as Yellow Submarine is the wormhole connecting them to this third Beatleverse, which is now under the influence of LSD. And so they send this Magical Mystery tour. We have hallucinogenic album imagery, and we have, with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the album that they spent 5 months in 1967 recording, the first concept album basically in the history of rock and roll. And as such, it's an innovation, and it foreshadows the coming of later concept albums like the Who's Tommy and Pink Floyd's The Wall and albums of that sort. This is the first album of that type. It's also the first album on which the lyrics are actually printed, of all the songs are printed on the sleeve. And it's the first album in which the 3-second interval between the songs is eliminated so that you get the illusion of continuous music all the way through, almost like Wagner's operas. Wagner changed opera by eliminating the recitative so that you have continuous music through the opera for the first time. The Beatles do something similar here. And they put these new avatars on the album cover, along with this pantheon of celebrities, some of which were dead at that time and some of which were still living. But it's basically a deferral to the elders and the ancestors of their tribe. Every tribe has to have ancestors that it defers to. And they appear on that wonderful image on the cover of that album, one of the great images in the history of rock and roll art, the cover of that album. And so now they send these individuals on a kind of virtual tour, a magical mystery tour. And it's brilliant. This is brilliantly visualized in the movie, the cartoon movie version of Yellow Submarine, as they journey through, basically as Alice goes down the rabbit hole into the non-Euclidean world of curved space, the electrotopic world of non-Euclidean geometry. So too with Yellow Submarine, they go into this non-Euclidean world of curved surfaces. And basically space, sound itself is non-Euclidean because it occurs in a sphere around us in a 360-degree radius. And so they go through this wonderful world of rubbery curved space in the Sgt. Pepper, and also on the album that follows it with Magical Mystery Tour. It's not one of their best albums, but there's some very good songs on it. And so that's the creation of the third Beatleverse. Now the band, meanwhile, is beginning to disintegrate, and Lennon and McCartney are beginning to vie more and more as time goes by for control over the band, that is to say, for control over the muse that is inspiring them with all this wonderful creativity. They're basically inventing rock and roll here, along with the Stones, of course, and the Who. But they're basically inventing rock and roll in a way here that becomes absolutely archetypal. They decide at this point, after this album, to go to India. They become fascinated with Hindu metaphysics, so they go and study with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and they live for a time. They get off the drugs for a while, and they write a whole new batch of songs in India. One of those songs is Dear Prudence, that John Lennon writes, which is an interesting song because it's the first time that he actually names the muse. Well, they had named the muse before with Michelle on Rubber Soul and Eleanor Rigby on on the album that followed that, Revolver, and then Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And of course, anyone who's taken LSD knows that when you look up at the sky, the night sky, the stars do indeed appear to glitter prismatically, so they do look like diamonds. But at the same time, we note that Lennon had written that song, and he had transformed his muse there in that song into a macrocosmic image of the nighttime sky, which was basically a retrieval of the ancient Egyptian sky goddess Nut, the goddess of the starry night sky. And so his image of the muse on that album is expanding and turning into a cosmic, engulfing great mother that basically is engulfing Lennon on that album. While Lennon's muse on the same album is beginning to shrink and become banal with lovely Rita, the meter maid who simply issues tickets to parked cars. And we'll see soon that the automobile will become significant in the destiny of McCartney's avatar. And so his muse is shrinking while Lennon's is gigantifying to cosmic proportions. But on the album, on the White Album, which is their next album, and it's their last great album, we have the song Dear Prudence, which is named after a real person for the first time. Prudence was Mia Farrow's sister, who happened to be living at the ashram at the time that they were there. And so for the first time, the muse is not only named but based on a real person. So this tells you the direction that Lennon is beginning to go. Soon he'll literalize the muse when he meets Yoko Ono, which he began to meet her about this time. And now the White Album is the last great Beatles album, and I believe it's the first double album in the history of rock and roll. And it is basically, as everyone knows, a collection of solo efforts. The Beatles can no longer really stand each other. The band is beginning to disintegrate. And each song on that album is basically written and produced and created by one of the Beatles. McCartney, for the first time, creates a Beatles song in which he plays all the instruments himself, in addition to writing the lyrics. I think that one's Why Don't We Do It in the Road? And George Harrison brings Eric Clapton in to collaborate with him on his While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And at some point, Ringo Starr quits the band, George Harrison quits the band, but they're persuaded to come back. None of them can get along, and so it's amazing that we have as great an album as we do have with the White Album. It's a fantastic achievement, but the band is beginning to disintegrate. And one of the problems now is that about this time while they're recording the album, John Lennon comes into the studio with Yoko Ono. He introduces a woman into the recording studio for the first time where women had been more or less forbidden. And not only does he bring a woman in, but he brings in this woman, which is now his muse, literalized. He's created a kind of profanation of the etheric muse, the fifth Beatle that had been there all along, by projecting her onto a concrete, real person and bringing her into the recording studio for the first time. And she actually begins to criticize their music. She offers suggestions for how songs might be improved. And also, she even sings backing vocals on a couple of the songs on the White Album. This is kind of a profanation, and the cliche is that Yoko Ono broke up the band, but as we have seen, the band was already disintegrating at the time that Yoko was brought in any event. But there's a profanation here. There is a symbolism about this, because the muse then, making off the absconding with the muse and literalizing her, concretizing her as Yoko Ono, a real person, the consequences of that become evident on the next album, Let It Be. When they go into the recording studio and the muse has her revenge and they can't get the album done, they can no longer stand the side of each other, and the songs that they record on that album are of course inferior to all the other music that they had created before. This is their weakest work. They knew that it was their weakest work, and so it wasn't working, and for the first time they walk away and leave an album unfinished, completely defeated by the process. Later it has to be finished for them, and it's put out after Abbey Road. They do one more album, of course, Abbey Road, which is their last album that comes out in September of 1969. At this point they have broken up. While recording the album, they do the final rooftop appearance on the top of Abbey Road Studios, as though they can think of nothing better to do, and that's their last public appearance as a band together, that rooftop concert. But the album comes out in 1969. It's not a great album. It's their last. But it is, of course, the Beatles. And even the Beatles at their worst are still, the music on these last two albums is still better than on the average rock album, of course. But now, an interesting thing happens is that Paul McCartney's avatar now becomes transformed into an urban legend and becomes mythologized about in America when, at Drake University, a sports writer named Tim Harper writes an article for the student newspaper in which he begins to suggest for the first time that Paul McCartney is no longer the real Paul McCartney, and that he was actually killed in a car accident and replaced by a double, and that we can begin to find clues for this on the albums. Then another student at University of Michigan in the student newspaper there, who was reviewing Abbey Road, decided to take this and elaborate with it, and he spins out this very elaborate urban legend about how McCartney was killed in a car accident and the top of his head was sheared off. They were recording another album at the time, which they were tentatively going to call Smile. And then the band members buried Paul and then replaced him with a double, a look-alike. And then at a radio station, listeners began to come down to the radio station pointing out clues on the albums. That's, for example, on Strawberry Fields at the end, where Lennon says, "I bury Paul," which you can vaguely hear in the background. He's actually saying cranberry sauce, which you can hear on an alternate take on a different album of that song. And that when some of the songs played backward, like Revolution Number 9, are played backward, they say things like "Turn Me On, Dead Man." And I've listened to those backwards recordings, and they take a lot of imagination to be heard intelligibly. And it's a bit of an affront to one's intelligence to imagine them at this point, at this rate of decomposition, to sit in the studio, wasting precious studio time, trying to figure out how certain words enunciated one way will create words enunciated backwards. Although since Rubber Soul, they had recorded some songs and some lyrics and some instruments backwards. They had already played around with that. But at this point, they're interviewed on talk shows. John Lennon goes on talk shows with Yoko, and they deny knowing anything about it. It appears in the media. It's picked up by Rolling Stone and the Chicago Tribune. This rumor that Paul might be dead. Rolling Stone does a cover story saying Paul is still with us. And so it got picked up, and it became this big sensation that caused the sales of Abbey Road to skyrocket at that point. But it is myth-making. There wasn't a bit of truth to it, of course, but it's basically, as we've seen, it's the myth of the doppelganger. Under electric conditions, we have the creations of avatars. When the individual descends down into the electric plasma pool and creates clones of his ego, he is basically replacing himself with an avatar. Just as, for example, Andy Warhol had tried to replace himself with an actor who went out on tour and answered questions for him at universities. It's that kind of a thing now. We begin to get this even in science fiction films now, with films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where we have individuals who are replaced by alien pods, and then it's basically the myth of the electric avatar that replaces the individual, such that electric culture, electric technology creates a society now that is so paranoid that no one now can any longer be trusted to be who they actually say they are. And so the psyche under electric conditions, one of the things it creates is paranoia and confusion, especially with these avatars. And so, and we also have, with the creation of this is Fred Laborde, is the individual who wrote this at the University of Michigan. Laborde's plugging in of the McCartney avatar into the celebrity death by car crash. We have the retrieval of that as a basic intrinsic structure now of one of the three celebrity death modes that we reviewed in previous chapters: the death by car crash, by stalker, or by drug overdose. And with the Beatles, we'll have two of those deaths, two of those basic death scenarios, although in Paul's case it's only fictional, it's mythical, urban legend, and in Lennon's case, of course, it will be literal, an actual terrible thing that befalls him. So we have myth-making here going on, and there isn't an ounce of truth to it. We just have it created by rumor. And so we can see the process by way of which rumor, left unchecked, can create myths. Just the same way, for example, that it became an urban legend that Walt Disney had been cryogenically frozen during his death, when of course he wasn't, he was cremated. But that's the process of myth-making, and so we have the creation of Paul's avatar as a kind of myth at this point.